guys, it's Godbars here, the self-proclaimed hip-hop historian, and this is the 23rd episode of my series where I grab a vinyl from my collection, talk about why I love it, what influence it has, and what its place is in the grand scheme of hip-hop. So, as I mentioned in my last video, while I wanted to do at least one West Coast classic in this group of 5 albums from the 80s, I'm only going to have that one, and then these next 3 are going to be East Coast because that's where the majority of the output in the 80s came from. While I started with Public Enemy because it's a personal favorite of mine, I wanted to go back a couple years to what's arguably the single most important influential album from the 80s in hip hop, which is Paid in Full. While it might not sound quite as modern as some of the albums that came after it in the 80s, Paid in Full is as embedded in the DNA of hip hop as an album could possibly be. I've heard people say that this album sounds old, and while that's technically true, I don't really feel like it sounds much behind the other production that was going on in 87. I feel like when you listen to albums like this, you kind of have to keep in mind that at this time there wasn't any 36 Chambers or Illmatic. No, It Takes a Nation of Millions, 3 Feet High and Rising, or Straight Outta Compton. Like I mentioned, Eric B's beats on here to me aren't vastly different from the production on other classics released that same year, like Criminal Minded by Boogie Down Productions or Rhyme Pays by Ice-T. That slower pacing was a trademark of early 80s hip hop, and I think it might be the biggest roadblock preventing younger fans from fully connecting with Paid in Full the way someone who was a fan upon its release would. However, these instrumentals are still a little faster than some of the stuff you'll hear on early Run DMC albums or even the first Beastie Boys album. And I can't imagine how this album sounded when it dropped compared to everything else. I don't think it had the biggest impact sonically. I may be wrong about that, but to my knowledge, despite the production on this album being iconic and fitting the experience perfectly, I don't believe it changed like the instrumental landscape of hip hop the way some other acts did. But again, this is completely from speculation. But on the other hand, I've heard people like DJ Premier say that this is undebatably the single best album in hip hop ever. And when you have a producer as influential as that saying that, obviously there has to be something to the production here. What this album did change, arguably more than any other album in the genre, is how MC structured and delivered their bars. And Rakim used his flow to practically single-handedly push the game forward by years. Not dissimilar to how Nas would shift the standards with Illmatic, but even with a debut as genre-changing as that, I'm not sure if it changed how people wrote and structured verses on such a fundamental level like Rakim did. Another very essential aspect to the influence of Paid in Full is how, along with guys like Boogie Down Productions, they were helping introduce a slightly more conscious angle into hip-hop. Up until this point, the more aware street rap wasn't really being recorded for albums or records. It seemed like hip hop was so fresh and still defining what it was, people probably didn't really think of it as a genre with multiple subgenres. They probably just saw every album as a general representation of what the culture was. The combination of forward-thinking topics mixed with a flow years ahead of his contemporaries made this album a massive success. You even listen to Rakim's OGs like DMC or Kool Moe Dee, and they talk about how impressed and happy they were with where the culture was being taken at this time, especially DMC, who details hearing Rakim for the first time and having the thought, "I'm done," because he was just so blown away by this young talent. Again, it's easy to listen to the album knowing all we know now about Flow and not be as impressed, but I'd recommend comparing it to some of the albums that came out that year or before it. Once you kind of get an idea where the game was at and realize how the vast majority of flows at the time were rather predictable, you respect the musicality in Rakim's flow, which makes sense given how inspired he was by John Coltrane. A good amount of hip-hop that came earlier in the decade was more call and response inspired, and the majority of the songs are either about partying or being an MC. Obviously, I'm not trying to imply there's anything wrong with this. As I mentioned earlier, this is such an early developmental state for hip-hop. The idea of just having someone rapping over drums was still foreign to most people. There were still already different voices and personalities in hip-hop that had their own styles, but the wide range of voices were mostly resigned to the same flows and inflections until Rakim opened the door. before. It's interesting to hear him talk about where he got the inspiration to start taking more liberties with his flow patterns and inflections, and he cited Coltrane as the biggest influence. And I feel like Rakim started to write with the jazz mindset, opened the door for all these other rappers who would gain inspiration from the same area, just down the line and in different ways. He'd also be more liberal with where lines would start and end, blending them by ending a line in the middle of a sentence, then picking it up at the start of the next line. That's just one of the many tiny, seemingly mundane but drastic changes Ra implemented into hip hop. It's been a common writing style in the genre forever now, but it was virtually unheard of at the time. Having your line kind of run into the next one or ending in the middle of a sentence and doing more interesting things with structure, it's not something everyone notices on the surface and appreciates, but even if they don't know why, if you put on a verse where somebody's structuring their verses in an interesting way next to somebody who isn't, they'll probably prefer the one with interesting structure, even if they don't consciously know why they prefer it. It was also a big step in hip hop becoming less about the yes, yes, y'all call and response party aspect that the culture was birthed on, and more about addressing issues that matter to you and your community. I mean, the sheer amount of famous lines you'll hear on Paid in Full that have been sampled on various hip hop songs over the last 40 years is staggering. Also, I think it's worth acknowledging that while Rakim took it to another level, Run DMC had raised the bar before him by adding a bit more personality and presence on the mic, though there was still a clear divide between that style, which was proficient at the time, with the more forward thinking inflections and deliveries Rakim would come up with. I feel like he also helped usher in a more poetic style of writing that wasn't just a song about one specific subject or item like a lot of previous hip hop songs had been. He just let his masterful pen flow and incorporated things he's seen and experienced throughout his life. While Eric and Ross still had somewhat extravagant costumes by today's standards at least, they related to lots of younger people in underprivileged areas through the authenticity in the lyrics. Rakim comes off a lot more like a starving MC trying to make his meticulous opening statement to the world than he does like some rich, out of touch celebrity talking down to the common people. Even on the albums after this one, Rakim never loses sight of what made him such a prominent figure in hip hop to begin with. And guys like him, KRS-One, and Cool G Rap are a few examples of the most groundbreaking lyricists that changed the way that we write in hip hop. These guys really helped push hip hop to that next level in the mid to late 80s, and the more street conscious yet intelligent and self respecting image they conveyed through their music gave millions of young black kids positive role models. Hell, I wasn't even a young black kid at all, and I'd still like to consider these guys role models of mine. There's practically an uncountable amount of rappers, DJs, producers, and just hip hop fans who have been affected by the likes of Paid in Full or Rakim in general. He most likely will remain in the top 5 for most influential rappers in the history of hip hop, and as long as rap music is kept alive in any form, we'll always remember and return to legendary pioneers like Eric B. and Rakim. My 3 favorite songs on this culture shifter would have to be I Ain't No Joke, the title track Paid in Full, and Eric B. as President. And I have to give at least one honorable mention to Move the Crowd. Thank you for watching my 23rd video. Next up is another beloved 80s classic that isn't quite as influential as this one, but really that's only because pretty much nothing is. It's still one of the most important hip-hop 80s classics and a personal favorite of mine. So be sure to tune in for that, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know what your favorite tracks on this historical piece of music are. And don't forget to have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time, okay? All right.